If only it were that easy, right?
Oh,
Thank you so much
for the invitation.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you all very much for coming today. I'm Shihoko Goto. I'm the Senior Associate with the Wilson Center's Asia program. Before we begin, I must say that I'm very grateful to my colleagues in the Latin America program for co-sponsoring this event, in particular Cindy Arnson, who I guess is not here right now. And also, I must give special thanks to the U.S.-Japan Research Institute, which is a grouping of some of the top Japanese universities, including my alma mater. This is actually our third time the Asia program that is working together with USJI on programming. The past two have really focused very much on TPP. Today, we will continue that discussion, but I know that many of you in this room have been very closely following the ongoing political discussions on the Hill about how and whether TPP will actually pass in Congress. The debate still continues to go on. And while some may argue that it may never pass, others are much more optimistic and that it's much more a question of when rather than if. But I think it's safe to assume that TPP passing is more, it will get a lot of congressional approval, less for the economic implications, but rather for its security implications. So for instance, the Peterson Institute has stated that the US gain from TPP is fairly minimal, about a 0.1% income gain by 2020, and that would only increase to 0.5% by 2030. So the economic arguments for TPP on the Hill are fairly weak at the moment, but certainly for security reasons, TPP is very important to US national interest and the United States' position as a Pacific power. So if we look at the Asia-Pacific region today, TPP is hardly alone in providing new frameworks to build new economic partnerships across the region. And these alliances are proliferating across the region. Our focus today will be what kind of coalition building is occurring on the economic front in the Asia-Pacific today, and how will this impact regional hegemony and the balance of power, both economically as well as politically. Of course, this is a very broad topic, but I think that it is nevertheless an incredibly important one, not least for the negotiations for TPP. And to tackle this great topic, I am delighted to be able to introduce some great minds that we are fortunate to be able to have join us today. You have their bios in front of you, so they really don't need much introduction from me. But I will introduce them in the order that they will be speaking today. To start off the conversation today is Takashi Terada, who is a former Wilson Center Japan scholar and currently a professor of international relations at Doshisha University. Following him will be Mauricio Moreira, who is the principal economic advisor on trade and integration at the IDB. And he will be followed by Kent Hughes, who is a public policy scholar here at the Wilson Center and is the de facto special economic advisor on economic affairs for the Wilson Center. So with that, Takashi.
Yes. Thank you very much, Shihoko, for your kind introduction about myself. As Shihoko just mentioned at the beginning, this is the third, the joint seminar between Wilson Center and USJI, US-Japan Institute. Again, I used to be here as a Japan scholar. I also joined Doshisha University. Doshisha is also part of the USJI member universities. And 10 universities and set up the non-proliferation organization based in Washington, D.C. 6 years ago. And well, we continue to make the better contribution about Japan, particularly from social science, like politics and economics and international relations perspectives. I myself, well, before joining the Wilson Center, I used to work for Waseda University, another university based in Tokyo, working quite, seriously for the promotion of USJI administration. So, well, since then, I have joined the USJI activities in Washington, D.C. since 2010 or 2009, something like that. And then I joined Wilson Center and now moved to Doshisha. So it's sort of natural development for me to set up this sort of a joint seminar between the two institutions I used to belong to. And again, this is the third one. The first one focused on TPP, and last one held in September, I guess, focused on AIIB. And so this time we tried to put together additional element was, of course, Latin American, the engagement, also the contribution to this debate. So on behalf of USJI, well, I would like to carry my gratitude to all of you who kindly joined these sessions. Again, twice a year, we're having USJI week, February and September. So, well, I'm not so sure whether we have a fourth one or not in this building, but if so, well, please come back and to have a chat with us. Again, Shoko has been always making a big contribution to setting up the joint session, and she also this time set up the synopsis as well as title. So competing and complementing. So this, it seems to me, indicate different institutions on similar type of the organization, focusing on the very same issues, development or trade integration. But important stuff, someone who tries to use for its own political, even strategic interest. Others are not necessarily happy or uncomfortable, but try to create sort of alternative institutions to meet its own interests. So that's why I think we tend to believe, the 2 or 3 emerging regional institutions and focusing on development, finance, or even trade integration, but they are competing. So my own interest is how they are competing. But on the other hand, for example, USJI had a big symposium in Tokyo last December. One of the keynote speakers, this time we talked and focused on TPP. One of the keynote speakers was Wendy Cutler, former USTR senior offshore, heavily engaged in the US-Japan stuff, as well as TPP negotiations. But she always said TPP or other regional institutions such as RCEP, Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, or ASEAN Plus 6 integration framework are complementary, not competing. Well, to some extent, I of course agree. But my own interest is how they are different. Also, well, I need to touch on the AIIB quite briefly. But this time, well, to illustrate the competitiveness rather than complementarities, I try to bring Japan's perspective or viewpoint on AIIB, because Japan is not a member of it, together with the United States and Canada. And Japan has been quoted, in a sense, by China, even late 2000. And one of the first countries China approached in terms of the AIIB development was Japan. Now still, Mr. Jin, already president of AIIB, has been saying, membership is open. Japan, United States are always welcome. But of course, not many people in Japan don't take, this is actually our intention, because Japan's participation would change, the quite big structure in terms of the governance, for example, in AIIB. Even China's, the size of contribution and the voting rights, etc., would need to be changed. Again, that would create sort of the delay in the promoting the AIB activities. So, but anyway, so what Japan did, instead of joining AIB, so this is the second approach which I take for explaining the competitiveness or competition in terms of the infrastructure finance. Well, again, first trade. Well, this is just to indicate who are in, who are out, in what institutions. Mainly, we're talking today the TPP, Trans-Pacific Partnership. And also RCP, it's a sort of we call round integration framework based on ASEAN. Starting with ASEAN, well, just established the AEC, ASEAN Economic Community, 31st of December, expanded ASEAN Plus 3. Now ASEAN Plus 3 framework is merged with ASEAN Plus 6 after the China-Japan's, well, sort of the consultation. Again, it's a very interesting consultation because the two nations are log ahead over many issues, including history, territorial disputes, and etc. But once TPP was pushed by United States, at that time Japan was not a member of it. Well, China and Japan came together how to discuss how two nations can be coming together to promote East Asian rather than Asia-Pacific regional integration framework. So this was the beginning of RCP, ASEAN Plus 6 framework. In 2013, negotiations started. I briefly probably touch on CJK, China, Japan, Korea, or Northeast Asia regional framework. We just finished the negotiation in Tokyo a few weeks ago, I think 7th, 8th round. But still, the three nations, China, Japan, Korea, have been struggling to find out a sort of the common ground, especially very basic, the element, which is, of course, market access. Even tariff, liberalization ratio, Japan has been always sticking to the traditional GATT Article 24, 90% coverage. But, China, Korea still try to lower the targeted liberalization ratio. It's about 60% or something like that. So this is probably one of the very basic approaches to promoting trade integration matter. But still, three nations, particularly between Japan as well and China, Korea, still there is big gap in terms of the promoting the issues. But as I try to demonstrate, what is probably most striking achievement these three nations, China, Japan, Korea, have achieved was actually to set up the regional integration, investment treaty. It's done 2 years ago. And of course, integration treaty has been included in most of the regional integration frameworks, even in Asia. So I try to just highlight a little bit on the differences in terms of the investment treaty here. So again, with this map, just to illustrate, as I mentioned, TPP, it's a square ones pushed by United States, and after the P4, original 4 members of smaller economies set up the P4 2006, and Bush administration announced it's joining the TPP 2008, and Obama's approval in 2010. So it's all sort of the Americans, the engagement in promoting the TPP framework, while the United States has been excluded from round or East Asian regional integration framework such as RCP. But as I mentioned, the TPP negotiations started first. America's interest in it was pushed by China's heavy engagement in the East Asian framework together with Japan. But ironically, U.S. went first and put the pressure on China and Japan, as I mentioned earlier. So this is, it's again simple comparison of the 3 different regional integration frameworks in Asia Pacific: TPP, RCP, and CJK. There are probably a number of ways to explain the particular differences. I think an interesting one was labor. Also, I didn't hear right, but environment. East Asian regional integration, even Japan's bilateral FTA never include environmental and labor issues. I think this is a purely American baby, and which has been always put in American bilateral, even regional FTAs. But of course, this put in a TPP. But some of the nations in East Asia are not necessarily comfortable with, for example, labor or environmental issues. Even ASEAN, 15 years ago, when the US and Singapore started negotiations for bilateral FTAs, and Singapore was nearly inclined to accept the labor and environment clauses. And most of the ASEAN nations wrote the opposition to the Singapore. But luckily at that time, the change of government from Clinton to Bush led to the elimination of these two clauses from the Singapore-US FTA. But nevertheless, these issues coming back, and now it's a bigger and more deeper regional integration framework, TPP. And also market access, the ratio, just put in the middle. As I mentioned, in the CJK, China-Japan-Korea FTA negotiation, it became just stuck, partly because of this, different, the targeted ratio. But TPP, 95% to 100%, but probably 95 probably is a more realistic, figure. Still, some of the areas excluded from Japanese viewpoint, agricultural products. But on the other hand, TPP is pushing Japan to liberalize quite a few agricultural sectors, as well as fishery and forest products. For example, fisheries, except for seaweed, Japan promised with TPP member countries to eliminate all tariffs within 10 years' time. Very fast time. Liberalization, which means reduction rather than elimination of tariffs on beef, sugar, providing the special quota to US and Australia on rice. Again, we never had done it before. So this is sort of the sanctuary product, which means Japanese government had never touched on it in terms of the regional, trade liberalization. But again, elimination of tariffs is politically so touchy and sensitive. But nevertheless, the deeper reduction, substantial level reduction in tariffs on those key agriculture products, again, I said politically very sensitive in Japanese domestic situations, is a big concession Japan made. So that's why Japan is in a good position to ask South Korea and China to make, the more bigger, the concessions in terms of market access. But anyway, so TPP is very high quality in terms of the even market access. Just to equally treat Japan's interest, which is automobile liberalization on the American market. 2.5% tariff ratio on the commercial automobiles will be eliminated, but after 25 years. And pickup truck, 25% tariff ratio, big, the tariff US has imposed after 30 years. So some Japanese automobile sector people say, well, actually TPP wouldn't bring us any benefit. 25, 30 years time, just a few percent tariff ratio elimination would be nothing. So some people say that's why TPP is purely American product. But later someone pays, AWE just for the China by Chinese government. But some people say, particularly Chinese people tend to say, TPP is just for American interest by American friends or like-minded states, etc. So even these, the verbal, exchange of the criticism, what tended to also indicate there's some competitiveness between China and the United States. So I think the US, China, is a big, the competition, the global and regional levels are heavily embedded in the sort of the TPP, even AIIB debate in recent years. So this is our investment ones. Again, Northeast Asia, China, Japan, Korea, still have struggling for establishing a regional framework for integration. However, CJK Treaty for Investment is actually concluded. And some of the issues are quite radically changed. Saying China has made the concessions. But probably some of the difficult point is still, the no negative risk. So in this case, some of the issues, for example, the performance requirement, these kind of stuff are still, they are not included necessarily. But protection is sort of the most important, element in terms of establishing the investment treaty with China for Japan as well as South Korea. So I think the compared with the China-Japan investment treaty signed in 1989, they're just too far right from my side. Again, most of the important, the elements of the investment treaty were excluded. But however, a 2014 version trilateral investment treaty includes, for example, umbrella clause, intellectual property rights, some of the transparencies, and etc. Even ISDS. These are included in trilateral investment treaty. I think the United States has been working together with China for setting up the bilateral investment treaty. I'm sure the all elements should be included. But what I want to emphasize here is that China died before even United States with Japan and South Korea. So last October, trilateral summit was held in Seoul, first time in 3.5 years, because of some history and the territory problems existed among three nations. So there was sort of the hiatus of the summit meeting over the last 3-4 years. But finally, the U.S. put the pressure on South Korea to come to deal with the Japan problems, and President Park Geun-hye accepted it. So now the Japan-Korea relationship has been improving, particularly even additionally pushed by the North Korean missile problems. So I think that now the Japan-Korea situation started becoming better, and that probably would be quite a good environment for the so-called trilateral cooperation, anything like that. So the joint statement issued last October actually highlighted the significance of the establishing FTA among three nations. That's not possible, particularly after the effective launch of the trilateral investment treaty. But look at the TPP investment chapter. Well, again, still not effective yet. All of the issues included, the negative risk, approaches. It's all put in the TPP investment chapter. So this is one of the reasons why China has been also hesitating to join the TPP, particularly the dealing with the state-owned enterprises and etc. Well, this is also a competition policy part, but anyway, this is also highly related to the investment chapter as well. So again, point is, TPP is more comprehensive, and the point is, other regional frameworks can come up with the same level of the commitment to the liberalization and investment. So this is quite, the big questions. Still more. I have 3 minutes. Okay. As I mentioned, AIIB and also Japan's approaches. Shinzo Abe, Japanese Prime Minister, to be frank, has responded quite swiftly to the AIIB issues. So I highlighted 2 elements, quantity and quality. And quantity part, for example, increasing investment in infrastructure in Asia by 30% to 111 billion US dollar during 2016 and 2020. I think that the figure was important, and because the AIIB and the figure is about 100 billion US dollars. So Japan won't say more than that. We are committing and something like that. And the Mekong River, this is sort of the contested area between Japan and China. not only high speed railway, now Thailand has just given the offer to the construction of the two high speed railways, not only Japan but also China as well. And China just interested in creating one belt one road strategy. Even now they try to include Indonesia's high speed railway construction. Japan had been working for nearly 10 years, but China just came in just 1 year ago. But Indonesia offered the China because Indonesia was said not to use any money from Indonesian budget. But of course now this is quite controversial. Whereas the government, the guarantee, anything like that, China said no, we don't need it. But now China suddenly started saying no, we need to have this sort of the guarantee, and Indonesia said, well, this is something different what you said before. So still, the contract was given to the China, but still not operation yet. So I don't know what's going on between Indonesia and China in terms of the high-speed railway construction. But anyway, this was considered to be the very important step for China to be promoting the One Belt One Road area. So Indonesia was considered to be very significant one. Mekong River is also too. But Japan said, we try to increase the money to be used for the infrastructure in the Mekong River in the Japan Mekong Summit meeting held last July. Even JBIC, Japan Bank for International Cooperation, JICA, Japan International Cooperation Agencies, their roads are now being revised so that even JBIC can put the money for the infrastructure investment, which might be a bit risky. So usually, the JBIC has shunned investing some of the project which considered to be relatively risky. The return is must. But it seems to me that China's push for AIIB, including some of the winning, won the contract in Asia situations, also pushed Japan to change its long-standing norms or standard in terms of the Asian infrastructure. What time is up? Okay, so this is what I try to say, how different, and particularly to highlight the competitiveness rather than the complementarity. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for that. That was a great overview. I've asked Mauricio to give us an idea about what does this mean for outside regions, especially from a Latin America perspective. So I'm hoping that you could shed some light on that.
Right. Is it on? Yeah, well, morning. Thank you for the invitation. I was particularly asked for addressing to the question of how the Pacific Alliance, the role that the Pacific Alliance plays in promoting Latin American and Asian Pacific relations, and how TPP and the other mega agreements affect the future of agreements such as the Pacific Alliance. So I'll try to address those two issues, but I think it would be useful to start by giving you a little bit of a background on the current state of Latin American and Asian relations, which I think, as you probably all know, I mean, it's pretty clear that the super boom of the last, say, 15 years, it's now over. The trade ceased to grow. I mean, it's stagnated since 2014. Exports are dropping fast. I mean, last year, Latin American exports to Asia dropped by 19%. To China was 16%. Trade as a whole dropped by 8%. So clearly, we are at the end of of a process, which I hopefully will be will give way to a new phase of this relationship, which I hope will be more mature. And I think some of the asymmetries, excesses, mystifications of this period of boom can be corrected. I'm not going to get into any detail of all those issues, but pretty to put it quickly, issues like the imbalance huge imbalance of trade, the fact that exports from the region were hugely concentrated on 2 or 3 commodities. Some of the countries in the region clearly had a more ideological than a pragmatic commercial approach to the relationship, particularly with China. And also the thing that the relationship was pretty much dominated by China, Japan influence and Korea pretty much fade away, even though Japan remains the most important investor in the region. So hopefully in this new phase we're gonna see some of those issues addressed. I see this current downturn mostly as a cyclical issue. I think it's for me it has been always obvious that China couldn't grow at that pace forever, investing 50% of GDP. Particularly with their response to the financial crisis. I mean, it would be impossible. At some point, there will have to be an adjustment. And I think we are getting to this process. I don't know how long this is going to take. I'll be rich if I knew that. But clearly, there's going to be an adjustment. But the main thing is, even though there's going to be a cyclical, there's a cyclical adjustment that it's going to be turn around at some point. I think there is an important structural element to this correction, which has to do with the fact that China is going to hit this diminishing returns inevitably. It has happened with all economies in the world in the process of growth and development. So China is bound to grow at slower pace. It's going through important structural changes as well. I mean, the services is going to be a more important size of, it's going to have a more important share of the Chinese economy, which means that it's going to demand less of those commodities that Latin American exports. So we are not bound to see the same hectic rates of growth that we saw in the past. But still, I mean, I don't think that the fundamentals of the relationship have changed drastically. I think moving forward, we're still going to see Latin America exporting a lot of commodities and Asia, exporting a lot of manufacturing goods, basically because of the resource endowments of those economies. And China remains very scarce on those resources. Japan the same. India even worse. So hopefully, I think this pattern is going to change, but hopefully we're going to see some change, and particularly in terms of promoting more diversification of the region exports. And this diversification is going to be even more important, given that the demand of commodities is not going to grow as fast as it has grown in the past. And for this diversification to happen, of course, I mean, I'm not putting all the burden on trade policy. I think that the fact that it's so concentrated has a lot to do with fundamental weaknesses in the Latin American economies. But I do think that there is an important component in terms of trade policy that explains why exports to Asia, the regional exports to Asia, are so concentrated, particularly in things like agriculture. And if you look at the tariff structure of any of those countries, China, Japan, Korea, there's a huge tariff escalation. As you add more value to those goods, you face higher tariffs, and there's this very serious issue of SPS and TBT, I mean the phytosanitary measures, technical barriers, and so on and so forth, which I think has been neglected by most Latin American government during the boom, and I think has a huge importance in terms of allowing the region to add more value to the commodities it's exporting to Asia. Of course, this agenda, you know, as in any issue in the region, there's a huge heterogeneity across countries. I mean, for some countries, this challenge of addressing those trade barriers with Asia, you know, for some countries, that's not a very steep challenge, but for others, you know, it's clearly, you know, daunting. And I'm here, of course, I'm talking about, you know, we can think of the Pacific Alliance countries, you know, Chile, Peru, clearly, because of the fact that they already have FTAs with the major Asian economies, are way ahead in terms of addressing this agenda. Mexico and Costa Rica also, but to a lesser extent, because they don't have, I mean, Mexico doesn't have an agreement with China. But if you think about, you know, countries, the Mercosur countries, I mean, Brazil, Argentina, Uruguay and Paraguay, they are clearly way behind. And for them, and particularly for them, which are, you know, major exporters of those agricultural goods, for them it's hugely important to address these basic trade policy issues, which they clearly have overlooked during this period of boom. So how the Pacific Alliance and the TPP fit into this scenario? I mean, the Pacific Alliance has pretty much been sold in this idea that you know, countries wanted to deepen their ties with Asia. But you know, and I'm an economist. I mean, if you look at it, it's not a, you know, a trade agreement with Asia. It's a trade agreement. It's an intra-regional trade agreement, and as such, you know, the impact with its trade with Asia, it's bound to be relatively small. It's not going to make a major contribution in terms of, you know, reducing trade costs, because it's not agreement with Asia. That's pretty much obvious. What I see, where I see the major impact that the Pacific Alliance can have is in reshaping the way the region has been approaching integration, regional integration. I think by now it's pretty clear that you know, the European model of custom union, of you know, of having institutions, of a common market has pretty much, you know, failed in the region. If you look at, you know, Andean community, if you look at Mercosur, you know, to a lesser extent CARICOM, you know, they all went to this, you know, European model, and they all fell very short of achieving its objectives for a number of reasons. You know, you can argue they're not politically stable. There's not much consensus in terms of what policy to follow. But this precisely was, you know, had to be one of the prerequisites for, you know, investing in this kind of model. So the Pacific Alliance goes, you know, towards more the NAFTA model, where it's very institutional light, which makes a lot of sense. I mean, you can hope to have you know, strong regional institutions if the member countries' institutions are weak. So it will be, you know, sort of a, you know, wishful thinking to believe that those regional institutions would work. And of course, they put a lot of burden, you know, fiscal burden and human capital burden in the member countries. And it's not very surprising that they didn't work. So with the Pacific Alliance moving forward, I think that the impact, the influence that this can have in the rest of the region, in the rest of, you know, in the Andean community, which is not in the Pacific Alliance, in the Mercosur, it's bound to be, you know, very important. And, you know, and perhaps the Pacific Alliance could be the embryo of, you know, of a regional-wide agreement based on these principles. It has to be very light in terms of institutions, you know, focus on the basics. You know, we want to have a free trade zone. At least, that's it. I mean, the sub-regional might, be more ambitious in terms of, labor movement or any other kind of cooperations, but the focus should be in building this foundation and make it work, which hasn't happened in the region so far. In terms of impact that the PA could have on the relationship with Asia, you could argue that, those countries could try to, as they have been saying, to negotiate jointly with Asia, a number of trade issues. You could argue also that, by being together, they might gain some economy of scale. Companies might be more competitive in the markets in Asia. They might attract more Asian FDI because, you're talking now about enlarged market. But I think that the most important impact that they could make, and I think it's very difficult to achieve, at least in the short to medium terms, would be to try to consolidate all the agreements they have with Asia. Then they would be able, for instance, to accumulate all the rules of origin and eliminate this transaction costs. But that, it's not that easy to do. I mean, not all countries have the same agreements of Asia. Mexico, for instance, doesn't have an agreement with China, unlike Peru and Chile. So, but again, this is, I think, in terms of purely trade issues, that could be something that would make the Pacific Alliance more effective in terms of reducing trade costs. In terms of the TPP, I clearly here see, now we're talking about an agreement which really can have an impact, a direct impact on trade barriers, on trade costs. It's an agreement which involves Asian countries. It involves, a big economy like Japan. But here again, given the fact that all the Pacific Alliance countries that are in the PPP already have free trade agreements with the other members involved, you are bound to see very small trade gains. In fact, if you look at the estimates, I think the best around is Petrie Plummer. The growth of exports for countries, for the countries involved, in 2030, it's going to be around 6 to 8%, which is not exactly huge. Peru always, gains more, and Mexico is usually, Chile, I'm sorry, is the one that gain less. Impact on GDP, it's pretty small. And of course, China is not there, which doesn't help to boost those impacts. But I think where it's more important, where TPP is more important for those countries, and I think for the others as well, but since we're talking about Latin America, is on the regulatory side. I think here, those countries have a lot to gain, particularly because the things that I said before. I think one of the major obstacles that Latin American exporters face in Asia are on, non-tariff barriers, are on, phytosanitary measures, are on technical barriers and things like that. It's once you normalize those things, harmonize those things, create basic principles of transparency, there you can have a major impact. And by bringing in things like, state companies, try to discipline those state companies, that could also have an important impact. Not immediately, if you look at the TPP right now, this is an issue with Vietnam, but hopefully this would have an impact that goes beyond TPP, it goes to the WTO. It would help to discipline Chinese state companies, which is, I think it's a major issue for the region when you think in terms of competition in manufacturing. All the heavy industry, all those excesses we are seeing now in terms of steel, all the heavy industries are having a deep impact in the region, and that could be addressed if those companies were operating in a more disciplined environment. Of course, there are costs for for those countries of joining this agreement. There's the issue of intellectual property, which has been discussed widely. There's the issue of capital control. There's the issue of enforcing those new standards. But again, I think that for them, it would be much more costly to stay out of these agreements, than not be able to continue to integrate the value chain of all those countries, than to go in. The gains might be small, but the losses of staying out would be significantly great. And to finish, I would say that the TPP, and you could argue also the TIP and the RCEP, all those MAGA agreements, I think should send a clear signal for the region in terms of regional integration. I think that for most of those cases, and if you look at the documents, the speeches, and so on and so forth, the main motivation of these agreements was to create an enlarged market and to gain economies of scale and to become more competitive. In an age where you're seeing major economies, mega economies like China, like India, and mega trade agreements, it doesn't make sense to go for small sub-regional agreements. You definitely have to go for something more ambitious, and that's why I said that hopefully the AP will be the embryo of something bigger. Go for I wouldn't say hemispheric, because I think politically it would be to resuscitate the FTA. I think it would be perhaps a long shot, but you can think of a Latin American free trade zone, and then you could really have an impact if the motivation is really to become more competitive and to have a better insertion in the rest of the world. I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Before I turn to Ken, I just want to ask, how much of this idea of a free trade zone within Latin America and hinge on the outlook for TPP? If TPP moves forward, if there are second entrant countries into it, there will be other Latin American countries that could potentially qualify and be interested. What happens?
I think, well, of course, the more Latin American countries enter into TPP, I think the more pressure there will be for the existing sub-regional agreements to try to come up with something more meaningful. I mean, I don't think they necessarily would disappear, because some of them have more ambitious objectives than the TPP. They want to integrate labor. They want to do a number of other deep integration things which are not in the TPP. But it does put a lot of pressure on them to try to, and particularly because this rhetoric of regional integration has been around since the 1950s, and all across the political spectrum. And if you talk to the people on the right, people on the left, they all want regional integration, and and there's this core thing that they all repeat the thing that this is going to increase, is going to boost competitiveness, is a larger market, and so on and so forth. So I think we're going to put more pressure on coming up with something reasonable that will involve the whole region. I think the prospect of countries like Brazil and Argentina joining the TPP, it's I wouldn't say that's it's right around the corner. So I think there's plenty of room for them to move into something that is regional wide, and particularly why? Because if you look at the current spaghetti bowl in the region and all the preferences that they have between them, I mean, you have 70% of the trade already liberalized. 70% of trade is already preferential trade, and the preferences are very close to zero. Now, the big missing link is Brazil and Mexico, and which is, for me, is the biggest puzzle in this whole thing. I mean, why Brazil and Mexico cannot come to an agreement? So we are not that far from a free trade zone in the region. We need to, get these two big guys to come to something reasonable. They already have some partial agreements. And it's not only to clear the spaghetti bowl, but if you allow accumulation, across the region, you're going to eliminate a lot of transaction costs. You're going to make the custom officials' lives much easier. You're going to reduce corruption, and you're going to also allow, for instance, that something that always come up in the political speeches is they all of them wants regional value chains. How can you have regional value chains if each agreement have different rules of origins? It's a huge mess.
All right, thank you. All right, Kent.
Thank you, Shihoko. Thank you for inviting me. Thank you, and thanks Cindy Arnson for co-sponsoring this and the USGI as well. And thank you, colleagues. I've been learning and taking notes as you talked. What Shihoko asked me to do is to step back and say, well, what do all these trends really mean for the U.S. and the U.S. economy, or some would even say continued U.S. leadership? Shihoko opened the discussion by talking about the prospects for adopting the TPP and how important it would be for people to look at it as a measure of not only national security, but say American leadership, American commitment to Asia, a sense that the U.S. is aware that Asia is this dynamic part of the world where it is growing incredibly rapidly. We always focus on China. India would love to be the next China. You watch the financial networks and you see ads from Indonesia, come invest in wonderful Indonesia, member of the $1 trillion GDP club, and member of the G20 and so forth. So I think the TPP is among other things, a recognition of the economic prowess and promise in Asia. From a U.S. point of view, I want to step back a bit and look at the world since the end of World War II. The U.S. would probably still say that we're looking at an institutional arrangement in the world that was basically constructed by Uncle Sam and the partners that met in Bretton Woods. There were 44 countries. It was principally the U.S. and Britain, and of course the U.S. had the industrial and financial strength at that time. The construction was in part based on learning lessons from the interwar period, where people felt competitive devaluations and escalating tariffs really contributed and exacerbated the Great Depression. Many people even saw it as contributing to the rise of extreme political movements in Europe. So the initial idea that lasted really until 1973, 1971 and then 73, was to have stable exchange rates, to have a system which would encourage trade negotiations and the steady lowering of trade barriers to foster more trade, and in place of the kind of reparations that were imposed on Germany, to create instead an international bank for reconstruction and development, now the World Bank, followed by a Marshall Plan by the U.S., and there was a great deal of emphasis on restoring a kind of global growth, although at that time, it's important to remember, much of the world was still a European colony. It's hard to remember that today. So the system then that was set up, of course, had always weaknesses. New countries were not included in the decision-making when they were set up. And on the other hand, I think you could say that those institutions have shown a certain flexibility and resilience. So after President Nixon closed the gold window in 1971 and then the 73 agreement where the world went to flexible exchange rates, these institutions found a way to adapt. There were, as we have here the IDB as an example, there was a spread of regional development banks, again, with the mission where Europe had been reconstructed, Japan had certainly recovered, but there were still challenges in many other regions of the world, and there was a sense that that development mission should carry forward well beyond just the idea of reconstructing the damage from World War II. So I think some of that structure still remains and continues to show a certain degree of flexibility. Perhaps the most recent example is the decision of the IMF to add the renminbi, the Chinese currency, that basket of currencies that determines the value of the special drawing right, or the so-called liquid gold. At the same time, we're so much living in a world that is nicely summed up by Fareed Zakaria as the rise of the rest. And there have been a lot of rising among the rest. Certainly, if we were having this conference in 1973 or 1980, we would be talking a lot about Japan and not very much about China. Now we have to talk about Japan and China and India's plans and the rise of Brazil, which has changed its thinking and its policies so much. So you now have, sometimes it's a marketing strategy, you have the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, and China, which in many ways had nothing much in common except the title, but has taken on a life of its own with now a BRICS bank in Shanghai. Then you had the Mint, Mexico, Ireland, what was it, Mexico, Ireland, Nigeria, and Turkey. So you had this. Then you had the PIGS, which was an unfortunate acronym about the countries that were struggling in Europe: Portugal, Ireland, Greece, and Spain. But all of that is a way of saying that as this system has moved forward, you see more and more relationships formed on a regional basis. We've just had a really, I think, a very good look at both Latin America and Asia, where there have been so much effort at forming different kinds of regional blocs. And you can't say that the U.S. has been foreign to this effort to form regional blocs. The North American Free Trade Agreement was an early example, followed by the Central American Free Trade Agreement. Now TPP, there's this active negotiations with the European Union about forming a transatlantic partnership. If you think of the EU as already being a massive regional agreement. So the U.S., in its own thinking, is gradually adapting to this reality. But there's a series of challenges that it certainly still faces. Part of it was the structure, the governance structure of the WTO itself. Unlike the World Bank or the IMF, where there was a limited number of guiding parties, the WTO is an extremely democratic institution. One country, one vote. So if hypothetically there was universal agreement, but Luxembourg didn't like the agreement, that could stall everything. So that remains a challenge. We've seen it with regard to the Doha round, which simply made minimal progress, and even where it looked like there was general agreement, they couldn't move forward because one major country really objected. So I think it's been natural to move toward these regional agreements, both of which foster trade, foster a degree of openness that can drive both economies of scale and hopefully innovation, and do give you a chance to experiment with different standards and different rules, and you can see how they work, and that could, in the end, build a consensus, a gradual consensus that, well, yes, we ought to take these to a global level to deal with the kind of thing Mauricio talked about, which he used the spaghetti bowl. When Asia got involved, they talked about a noodle bowl. So we have a complicated diet here of trade agreements, but the complexities of rules of origin certainly make it more difficult to have the kind of advantage you could get from really effective supply chains. So again, I'm looking at this through American eyes rather than just the world eyes, but I think from the standpoint of the U.S., it sees more and more not only of regional trade agreements that are going to be reality. There are a number we haven't talked about. There's some negotiations with South Asian countries. There's the Russian initiated Eurasian community. ASEAN itself is, as you mentioned, taking ambitious steps to the future. So what does this mean then for the U.S., which has often played a leadership role in building a broader trade arrangement around the world? I think the U.S. has to recognize we're going to have a emergence of different players, that we've gone from some multinational companies to a growing number of global companies. They think globally. They see the world as its oyster. They may be historically Japanese or German and American, but increasingly they really do see themselves as citizens of the world, which means there's a degree of flexibility and fluidity in investments that may not have existed 20 or 30 years ago. The U.S. continues to feel that we ought to build a system based on rules, where there's not sudden flexibility because there's a political advantage here or there's a short-term economic advantage there. On the other hand, there's going to have to be a recognition of a number of other realities, starting, of course, with the demand by China and others to have a more prominent seat at the table when you start to design a new set of rules. The U.S. itself needs to realize that there are a number of different paths to growth. The biggest challenge was actually posed, I think, by Japan when it developed what many people call the East Asian miracle. The GATT was set up on the assumption of the theory being limited government engagement and level playing field competition among private companies. East Asian Miracle took a different approach, much closer government and corporate involvement, a degree of export subsidies, some protection for local markets, borrowing intellectual property, a whole host of initiatives, including making sure that your currency was at a value that fostered your own export competitiveness. And I remember first working on Japan and saying, they're violating every single rule I learned in graduate school in economics, and they were doing great. So I think we have to recognize that there are different paths to development. And even looking back at U.S. history or German history or other countries' history, in fact, the path to development was not always one that took what people often refer to as the Washington consensus approach. Also, there's going to be a need to recognition that even in the countries that are described as capitalist, there are a whole different host of approaches. The UK is a bit more like the US. Germany has its own approach. France certainly does. So that we'll need to think of rules in the future that accommodate these different systems where they appear to have their own degree of success. The final element, of course, is that where the U.S. really could almost call the tune in Bretton Woods, looking to the system that would emerge at the end of World War II. This is going to be an era in which there's going to be much more negotiation by alliance. And the U.S. will need to think clearly about a couple other priorities that have emerged. Mentioning the intellectual property and the debates over intellectual property. Even here and in advanced industrial countries, there's a debate of where that line of protection ought to be. And when the line is too tight, it can really retard future innovation. We need to get a sense that rules need to be set to focus on the innovative economy and not just sort of the current trade relations. We've recently hosted here delegations from the Brazilian and Mexican legislatures, and these members were entirely focused on working to adapt what they viewed as a successful innovation system in the United States to Mexican and Brazilian conditions. So this is a whole new element that people will be focusing on in growth, and they'll want global rules that help to foster that. And finally, the other element in the IP is that there's a concern in terms of social justice, two concerns. One is developing countries often cannot afford the price of developed country pharmaceuticals and other innovations. And there needs to be a thinking through of how to respond to that need. And finally, more and more countries recognize that these enormous fruits that have come with globalization need to be fairly shared. And if they're not fairly shared in a world which is increasingly either democratic or certainly recognizes the pressures of the populace, there's going to have to be strategies to make sure that these fruits are fairly and equitably shared. So let me stop there.
Thank you, Kent. Before I open the floor to questions, I wanted to invite our panelists if they have any comments that they would like to share. Don't hold back.
I was going to ask Japan, if I may. Here, there's some concern about foreign direct investment that would acquire key high-technology businesses that are important both for growth, but certainly for national security. Is there a similar concern in Japan, and if so, what policies would you suggest they pursue?
It seems to me that Japan's, the acceptance of foreign direct investment is quite, relatively lower than other Western economies like United States. And as you just, brilliantly described some of the history of the international economy just now, of course, one of the major concerns the U.S. put to Japan in 1980s was, of course, closed market. And Toys R Us actually, was blocked by some of the Japanese domestic growth that put the pressure on the American government. And this was the beginning of the Structural Impediment Initiative talk in 1989, 1990. The very first time Japan accepted the sort of the foreign government domestic intervention. So again, some critic on TPP actually said, but this is a repetition of the Structural Impediment Initiative talk, because that also, allow the foreign government to be intervened in some of domestic issues. But it seems to me this is sort of the natural, the process in terms of the regional or even integration or bilateral FTAs. So now the SWI, took place in 1989, 1990, nearly 25 years, more than 25 years ago. But the situation was totally changed. And now the Japanese government, try to create some of the policies to encourage more investment. This is important source of the employment. But of course, Japan's society is a bit, the constraining different ways, because that would create more competitions. And so I think this is very similar to what's going on in the U.S. presidential campaign in terms of the free trade. And but it's all domestic politics in Japan, with Shinzo Abe government, since December 2012, had maintained the quite high popularity, or in a sense, support ratio, more than 50%, continuously over the last 3 years. And that, they pushed the Abe government to implement the quite radical the fiscal or even economic policies, including the quantitative, the approaches for the fiscal policy, etc., and creating the more environment for the weaker yen, etc. Mm-hmm. But TPP is expected to push Japan to be more open. So one of the radical reform at home has been underway is the agricultural liberalization. Mm-hmm. And the political lobbying group is now deprived of some of the lobbying powers. So I think this is only made possible after such a powerful government, if we made a sort of the determinant mind and to make Japanese economy open. And so I think the investment is considered to be more significant role in terms of Japanese engagement. So I think regional integration, even allowing the foreign government to be, touching on some of the domestic issues, it's sort of inevitable. And I think more Japanese try to understand, these issues. So I think TPP debate ratification process to be held in the next 1 or 2 years' time, it's sort of the quite critical period of time for changing Japanese, the social mind in terms of the facing with the international competitions.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Could I ask the Brazilians? Well, we should go to the audience.
If we have time, we can come back to you. If you could speak loudly, and we do have one microphone. Maybe you could just. We have two. Oh, okay, we have two microphones. If we could go to the gentleman with the red tie. If you could wait for the microphone. Hang on, turn it.
Speak loudly.
Wait. We are actually recording this, so it is better to have it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. My question is about Silk Road Initiative of China. Do you see any connection? It's, as I think, $40 billion fund. Synergy, complementarities with AWIB, and how does it relate to other initiatives, United States in the region, and why and how, if yes, Japan is changing the opinion towards AWIB, how would you consider Silk Road Initiative, I mean, both roads? Because it seems there are a lot of projects already, over 1,000 projects launched by China, last December meeting in Washington. So this is now taking place beyond regional institutional organization and agreement. The projects have already started. My comment is the US and Japan are the best qualified countries to provide expertise and resources, in particular, all kinds of competencies for Silk Road programs. I remember for UNESCO Task Force, I could not initiate anything serious with UNESCO for the last 16 years without going to Japan or to United States. So there you can do something both together and separately, and probably there's some synergy with what you know. Thank you.
That's a Takashi question.
Oh,
yes.
okay. I think there are probably two dimensions to answer this question. One is politics. Another is, of course, economics. Well, politics is probably quite heavily related to the sort of the economics, and this is also related to the Americans, the sort of the Asian pivot strategy, towards Asia Pacific. So China's so-called pivot strategy is more Westernwards, even covering the European Unions. So there's no wonder the UK, they initially showed an interest in joining the AIIB, which actually will change the sort of the whole structure. At that time, quite a few actually put the suspicious views on the AIIBs, in terms of the transparencies and governance systems. But still, Japan, the United States share the sort of the concerns about the transparencies. Even the China tried to utilize the so-called ADBs, estimate in $8 trillion US dollar demands, the 2010 to 2020. So of course, World Bank, ADB cannot cover all of them. But of course, this was important in terms of the setting up this sort of the, economic zone towards the west from the China. So I think Indonesia, the highway railroad, contract was considered to be quite symbolically significant. As a one step towards this sort of long-term objective of establishing the One Belt, One Road towards the end of the European continent. So AIIB is considered to be a system for realizing this China's long Chinese dream, what Xi Jinping called. But Japan had, U.S. of course, heavily engaged in so-called ADB, Asian Development Bank. And of course, most significant approach is ADB, which of course shared by World Bank, is the reduction of poverty. But this is very different from AIIB, purely focusing the infrastructure investment. China also said to the India once that, the whether conditionality includes some political, such like human rights, or environmental, the consideration. And China, at that time, I don't know about now, because China received a number of criticism from Japan, the United States, other countries. But at that time, 1 year ago, said no. So this is very different from the ADBs, these conditionalities. And of course, World Bank tried to share that kind of the norm. So again, there are a number of ways for indicating the differences between the existing multilateral development bank like World Bank and ADB and the AIIB. But I think China's record history of the sort of the ODA has also created a number of the suspicions as well. And the Philippines is one of the cases. The Export-Import Bank of China suddenly, terminate its engagement. So there's no way for the Filipinos, the railway construction. And Japan actually came and to intervene to help the completion of this project. Thailand also now they struggle with the payment of the higher interest rate, 6%. Also ADBs, the average is just 0.1% or something like that. So point is, if AIIB followed sort of the China's approach to the investment, infrastructure, and etc., of course, that would create a number of the problems, and also norms and standards in Japan, the United States has pushed in terms of the investment, infrastructure investment is totally different. So this is the basics for the Japan's and hope maybe America as well, the hesitation to be engaged. That's what I just described in PowerPoint. Japan took all its own ways to meet some of the criticism from Chinese side. Usually it took longer time to make a decision. ADB also was criticized, but ADB and Japanese investment bank tried to shorten the investigation period to make a decision on the certain infrastructure investment. That's obviously a response to this China's, the announcement of AIIB 2013, and also One Belt, One Road. So TPP, some people say it's totally irrelevant to AIIB and etc. But again, as I mentioned in the beginning, politically speaking, they are highly related because what just Kent said, the Washington consensus and the Beijing consensus. Again, terminology doesn't matter in this case, but the point is economic policy, even trade, investment, and also the foreign aid are very much different. So I think still, we need to check, but China was said to be changing some of the governing rules on economic senses. And AIIB or One Belt, One Road were considered to be a sort of the tools or means to achieve such a long-term and big, the strategy or objective of China said.
Thank you. I see a couple of hands, and we're running short of time, so why don't we take 2 questions. I'm going to take one from Andrew, and then the gentleman in the blue shirt and tie.
Hi, Andrew Yo, Associate Professor at Catholic University. I have a question for Professor Terada and then also for Dr. Hughes and Moreira, if they might be able to weigh in. But we have the TPP and RCEP here, but then 2 other, as if there aren't enough alphabets there. I mean, there's also the Comprehensive Economic Partnership of East Asia, CEPEA, and then the Free Trade Agreement of Asia Pacific, FTAAP. So my question is first with the CEPA, I know Japan had pushed this for several years, but it's kind of disappeared. So I'm wondering, is it because they've now subscribed to RCEP that there's no need to push this further? So I was wondering what Japan's position is on that agreement. And then with the FTAAP, this is something that China has been really promoting. I remember at the 2014 Beijing APEC meeting, they were really trying to push this forward. I wonder what other Japan or the United States or from Latin American countries, what their feelings or sentiments are on this FTAAP, even though we have other things on the table, the TPP and RCEP. Thank you.
If you could hold that thought, and if we could go to the can you, Andrew? The gentleman in the blue shirt. Thank you.
Thank you. Peter Rashish from Transnational Strategy Group. I have a question for Mr. Moreira. I did note you had a bit of skepticism about what I'm going to say, but when the new Argentine Commerce Secretary was in town earlier this week, he did say that the government, Macri government, would like to consider joining TPP and even further down the line TTIP. Of course, to do that, at present, Argentina would have to join it along with its Mercosur partners. But you now would have Argentina and Paraguay and Uruguay, fairly liberal, open-minded, open-oriented countries for trade. So my question is, what do you think the chances are that during the current Rousseff administration that Brazil will decide to also adopt this kind of more open pro-trade attitude, which would then allow the four Mercosur countries, for example, to apply to join TPP?
Okay, thank you. Who would like to go first? I think Mauricio should go first.
Well, thank you for the questions. Yeah, I mean, the Rousseff government has been giving some signs that they would, change their approach, the foreign policy in general, and the trade side of this foreign policy as well, and with the visit here to the U.S. and some of the coalitions that. Some parts of the coalition that support her government, also gave signs that they want to change things and be more aggressive, and they clearly realize they're falling behind. There was this thing with China that was pretty much more ideological. Of course, there is this huge economic element as well, because Brazil was selling tons of commodities to China, but there was this realization that they were selling, soy, beans, and iron ore, whereas, to the U.S., it was a much more diversified and sophisticated export composition. But, at the same time, there's this huge political crisis happen. And I don't really see the government having any political clout to push anything ambitious, something like TPP or what I do see is, and apparently they already discussed this possibility, is to allow the members of Mercosur to go along and sign their free trade agreements. And that would give, for instance, Argentina more leeway to go forward. And there's this ongoing negotiations with the European Union, which now apparently Argentina was dragging its feet. Now it might go forward. So there are some signs there, but I see it's complicated. And even in Argentina, for instance, they already said, Brazil and Argentina have been promising free trade in autos, in cars since the early 90s, and they keep postponing it. And now with Macri, there was this expectation that they will finally liberalize, which is 40%, 50% of the bilateral trade. But then Argentina said, well, not yet, let's wait and see, the adjustment to go through. So even Argentina, I think that in the short term, it's going to be complicated to go beyond perhaps the European Union agreement. But there might be, something on the table with Mexico. But TPP, I think I still think it's a long shot.
All right. Kent?
Well, I think from a U.S. point of view, there is such a focus, first on TPP and then on TTIP, that to some extent they have neglected some of these other opportunities. I do think that the interest that Mexico showed in being part of the TPP and Mexico's interest in becoming ever more part of a North American platform, I think will open up again a greater dialogue with the rest of Latin America, and a re-awareness going back really to George Bush, the 41st, H.W. Bush, who was a strong advocate of the free trade area of the Americas. So I think that will come, with regard to Brazil, people are aware that there's a certain degree of political turmoil right now in Brazil, which I suspect will have very positive outcomes, but probably serious trade negotiations right now would not be at the top of the Brazilian agenda.
Yeah.
Thank you. Well, FTAP was, in my view, was American product. It's an APEC-wide FTA, 21 member economies. So why U.S. tried to push FTAP in 2006? 2006 onward, APEC has, employed this jargon or abbreviation in APEC official document. Why? Because East Asian framework, well, as you described, CEPIR, it's a Japan's word, Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement, 16-country framework for FTA was pushed by Japan, particularly Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry, without any domestic consultations, like foreign affairs, etc. And the point was, America was a bit worried. As far as I remember, there was someone in the White House said, if this proposal, excluding United States, were proposed by China, that would be understandable. But this was proposed by Japan, America's key allied nations, excluding United States, create a sort of the Asian integration. That was sort of the new approach in East Asia. It was 2004 and 6, 4 and 5. And America found APEC as the only regional institution in Asia, which includes the United States as a member, and pick up suddenly FTAP as a sort of the regional integration framework which the United States found quite comfortably. So 2010, APEC was held in Yokohama in Japan. Yokohama Declaration has a very interesting sentence. FTAP could be realized through in pursuit of 3 different subordinate regional institutions. Well, this is not the exact word, but in my explanation. 1, ASEAN plus 3, 13 member countries FTA framework. Second, ASEAN plus 6 regional integration framework, which we used to call CEPIR. And then TPP. And Japan was not a member of TPP at that time. So even Japan was host nation of Yokohama APEC meeting, Japan couldn't announce its own participation. But thanks to US or other friendly nations, Prime Minister Khan was allowed to attend TPP informal summit meeting. So this is sort of the important, the event which I try to explain in terms of the China's interest in FTAP. So TPP at that time, negotiations were advanced. Now Japan was a member of it, and creating a lot of pressure because TPP were expected to be created and to be setting the sort of the standards of the economic rules in Asia Pacific. And as you know, other ASEAN member states like Indonesia, Thailand, Philippines, and South Korea are now interested in joining TPP. So TPP is open-ended framework, could probably more expand it, and creating more pressure on China in terms of trade diversion. And of course, steel export is a very important source of the economic growth of China. But the TPP with more members would be expecting reduced China's the export to other countries. So I think China really needs to take some steps to stop this trend. RCP, ASEAN Plus 3 framework, is one of them. That's what I mentioned at the beginning in this session. To try to come to Japan, regardless of political tensions between 2 nations, and to work together to push East Asian framework. So this is Japan-China's joint approach in face of the TPP development pushed by the United States in 2010. But Japan joined eventually anyway. Change of the government helped really so much. So FTAP now picked up with China as sort of the different framework, TPP. But American people, I met former White House person 2 years ago. Hey, Takashi, remember, this is our product. This is our concept. So China's, the real interest in FTAP was highly welcome. So China believed this was competing regional integration framework. But American, particularly this person said, he's in the CSIS now, said to me, no, this is our product. So it's China, it's approaching to us. So I think the American or Chinese, the approach towards FTAP and TPP seems to be quite different. That's another, problem in terms of the sort of the complementary role, we are discussing in this session in Asia-Pacific regional integration.
All right, thank you. I'm afraid the time has come for us to say goodbye. Before we do all go our separate ways, I wanted to highlight that we do have 2 events coming up. One is on March 3rd in the afternoon, I believe, from 3 o'clock. It'll be about U.S.-Japan relations with a focus on both economic and security ties. Those of you interested in negative interest rates and the implications of that, please do join us. The other is a very security-focused one. It'll be on March 7th. I believe we are serving lunch. So and it will be about the lessons to be learned from the Cold War and U.S.-Japan relations and vis-a-vis relations with the Soviet Union, now Russia. So I hope you can join us then. But if you could all join me in thanking our 3 speakers. And I want to thank you too for coming. Thank you very much.